Well, hi everyone and welcome. So I'm Carmen. As some of you may remember me, Cindy's really sad that she can't be here today. However, on par with today's theme, she's doing her civic duty today and serving as a jury. So as everyone's coming in, I'd like them to enter their name and location to the chat so that way Marie and Whitney can see like the vast audience that is here and kind of where everyone's from. And then today's question in 5 words or less is how are you feeling today? Um, so yeah, put that into the chat. And I'd like to take a second to introduce Marie and Whitney, Marie Morris and Whitney Bruce, and I'm going to let them take it from here. So welcome everyone.
Hello,
Hi,
everyone. Oh,
hi, welcome. Thank you all for coming and spending your Friday with us. So Maria and I are going to introduce ourselves, but apparently government relations is actually a Portland thing, because Marie is from Portland, Oregon, and I'm from Portland, Maine. I'm Whitney Bruce. I'm an IEC, about 25 years. I live in the greater Portland, Maine area, work with students all over the country. And my government relations journey is a long one, actually started in high school, when I interned on Capitol Hill. And in my adult life, I've been on both the HECA and IECA government relations committees. I'm currently the chair of the IECA committee. And I've also been on the New England ACAC Government Relations Committee, and I've attended a number of fly-ins at the state level and at the national level to advocate on issues related to higher education um, for students. And I find it to be an incredibly um, powerful experience to witness our democracy at work. As part of introducing ourselves, Maria and I also thought we would share with you our regular diet of reading on government issues. I'm a regular reader of the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times. I'm a huge fan of Heather Cox Richardson, and I do occasionally jump into the late night comedy circuit and collect some news there. I tend to stay away from social media. As part of my government relations work, I also follow newsletters from my legislators, the Senate Help Committee, which is Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and the House Education and the Workforce Committees. Professionally, I read Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle of Higher Education on a daily basis. Marie?
wow. Well, following that note, I'm Marie Morris. I am an IEC as well. I'm in the Portland, Oregon area, so we are coming to you coast to coast. Um, I have been very interested in government relations work for a number of years, not quite as long as Whitney, but actually attended the NACAC Advocacy Day on the Hill before when they used to do it years ago. And I came home from that and thought, why doesn't HECA have a government relations committee? And so I actually spearheaded and formed that. And I've since kind of moved away from that a little bit with HECA, but I still attend NACAC advocacy days. I'm the co-chair for Oregon with PNACAC government relations. One of the things that we did in Oregon this year was, or last year we piloted was a voter registration at the National College Fair, which was very successful. And NACAC has now taken up that mantle, and that's a thing at the National College Fairs now. Even though the kids can't vote till they're 18, but they in Oregon they can register when they're 16. So kind of getting them in the loop with all of that. Let's see. I just broke up with Twitter X, whatever you call it. I just couldn't handle it anymore. I am not on Facebook a lot, so I guess I am a social media consumer a little bit, but not a lot. I read Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Education or Higher Ed. And like Whitney, the New York Times I follow pretty closely. And I also, and if I'm watching the news, which my son thinks is always kind of a funny thing, it's usually News Nation, that kind of thing, and some of the late night hosts. Um, what that's I think that's me. That's enough about me. So, I think one of the things that Whitney and I have been talking about this we've had a couple meetings just talking about this And so we wanted to get that sense of how is everybody feeling today. We had an election just a little over a week ago, and we've got some changes coming. And so really what we want to do is talk about that and talk about the potential changes and maybe give you some tools that you can use going forward. So do you want to continue, Whitney, there?
Sure. So, um, there's a lot to talk about, and I think the first thing to acknowledge is that for most people, any kind of change provokes anxiety, and that can be excitement anxiety, it can be anxious anxiety, and it can be in your personal life, it can be in your professional life, it can be related to the election. Um, and to just acknowledge that there is sometimes some discomfort, even when it's something that you're really excited about. And that's why we're here talking. And it's something that gives us a chance to look into the crystal ball and think about positives and negatives for the world that we live in, and where we're going from here. Um, Things that we can talk about today. Marie and I are IECs, and our work and our government relations lens is always about how do these potential changes to higher education and to the transition to higher education impact our students and our practices. So we can talk about um, funding and student loans and diversity and questionable majors and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, you know, we've talked about the between the two of us about the difference in higher ed leadership and what a business lens over an education lens brings to it. And there's so much within that we can cover and places that we can go today, and that'll be governed a little bit by what happens in the chat as well. There are things we won't talk about. Marie and I are not lawyers. And so we are not going to put ourselves forward as people who have a deep understanding of the law. For me, that particularly comes into play if we're talking about Title IX issues, which are incredibly complex and certainly a part of the changing landscape over the next short to medium term, most likely. And Marie and I both have longstanding and deep affiliations with HECA and IECA and have held leadership positions within the organizations. We are not here to represent those organizations today. We are here representing ourselves and hopefully facilitating an opportunity to think about the issues a little more deeply um, on your own and going forward, and perhaps find ways in which you can get involved in issues that are meaningful to you as we move forward into the next governmental transition.
Great, thanks, Whitney. So again, back to the whole idea that change creates anxiety, and we're going to try and just help everybody with that. I think that one of the things too is we don't know. Okay, we're hearing every day cabinet announcements being mentioned, being named. And we were also just talking about, we don't remember in the past ever hearing cabinet names being released so quickly after the election. But I think it's important to remember that, all of these positions that are coming out they still have to be confirmed by the Senate. Now, some may, feel that, well, it's a trifecta in the legislative, the between Congress and the White House and the Supreme Court. But still, there are still things that have to be confirmed and processes to take place. And things don't change overnight. If you've done any, followed anything in Washington, things don't happen overnight. So, from that standpoint, I think if that helps to just hold tight to that a little bit, I think that, and again, back to, the topics that we're going to talk about, are the Department of Education, and the big one there being, will it be eliminated? And again, we are going to share with you some notes, but there was a really good podcast that American Council on Education, or ACE, did, and it was all about what's going to happen, kind of thing. And they were very, very clear that you just don't dismantle the DOE, right? You just don't take something apart like that. Now, will it shift? There'll probably be shifts, right? I mean, the talk that the student loan program could go over to the Treasury, and the Office of Civil Rights could go over to the Department of Justice, but we still don't know. So I guess that's what I'm holding on to, is we really don't know a whole lot just yet, but we want to be aware too. And there's things that we can do. And so educating yourself, and where do you get your news? And that's why we mentioned that in the beginning as well. So, there's some things that we can do. Whitney, you want to talk about executive actions?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this DOE
Okay.
concept, right? Because the DOE is, obviously it's a cabinet level, it's got a cabinet level secretary. It's an administrative department within the government. It has a massive budget. It has a couple of main functions, and they impact students and families in the education space in a number of different ways, right? So, you know, the reality in my simplistic view, I break the DOE down into a couple of important functions for us to think about going forward, right? The sort of more straightforward one is that the DOE is a collector and aggregator of information about educational outcomes and statistics. And there's been talk of, okay, that function could move over to the Department of the Census. But okay, that's an important function. So what's going to happen, and what values are people finding in the Department of Education, in that data collection, and what are we seeing there? One of the legislative bills that's come forward in the past couple of sessions that we're expecting to be reintroduced again next year, because it does have bipartisan, bicameral support, is the College Transparency Act, which would allow students and families, that would require standardized reporting of college data. So that that outcome data about graduation rates, about employment, about salaries, about retention and completion, that data would be much more standardized in its reporting out, which is something that does serve families, and we hope that that happens. Second function of the DOE is the Office of Civil Rights within the DOE, which oversees um, all of the Title IX stuff, which could change, and some of that could potentially change through executive action, as best I understand. And so for transgender students, this can feel particularly scary right now. And for the families that support transgender students, this is where this is the home of that button issue, that clickbait of who participates in girls' sports. Um, and so what changes might we see there, is something to pay attention to and to think about. Um, and as you said, Marie, the Department of Education also houses our student loan functions. One of the things that I heard President-elect Trump talk about over the past campaign season was the idea of privatizing student loans. We've also heard about moving that to the Department of Treasury. I can see that having real impacts on our students and the way they access it. My initial fear would be, really, we're going to try to make another organizational shift with the FAFSA, and we think that's going to work out well. Um, it's really unclear. I can't see a way in which privatization is a positive um, in the student loan marketplace. So those functions in the DOE are kind of a big deal. The DOE also covers a lot of K-12 education issues. And I think it's important to recognize that what happens at the K-12 level impacts the way students move on to higher education and what happens in that transition. And so I actually think that this is one of the big places where we may see a shift, and that's with privatization and school vouchers. And that has been a big component of President Trump, of other Republican platforms. Um, and in certain states, the policies vary in states right now as to how families can access and use those. But what that does to our public education systems, K-12, is really important. And so that oversight from the DOE, to me, is something that helps us maintain the balance between states' rights or state controlled decisions, which education is predominantly a state controlled decision, and federal control. So there's that check balance that for hundreds of years in this country has worked really well with our Constitution. And I think that's where what we're seeing in the chat about the potential for the Secretary of Education and for other cabinet level appointments to go through a recess appointment process and have secretaries confirmed um, without a have them confirmed without a Senate confirmation hearing is alarming for sure. Um, because we don't necessarily know what all of this is going to look like, and we're not entirely sure what that the people who are being put forward for these are coming with the experience and the background that's going to serve them well. So I think a lot of you have probably been following the Trump's request for the Senate to approve recess confirmations, which would apply to administration officials and to judicial appointments, which essentially removes that check balance between the Senate and the executive branch in terms of those appointments. Personally, I find that really disturbing. I like checks and balances. I believe strongly in fairness and justice and pieces like that. So that irks me. Um, and so I think what we're thinking about is what's going to happen with the Senate, and are they going to stand up to Trump? Are the Senate Republicans going to stand up to the president and exert themselves as a majority, or is it going to be a what Trump says is what happens? And that remains to be seen. Although Senator Thune, as the majority leader, is probably leans more towards a strong Senate and less towards a Senate that lies underneath the executive branch. So I just covered a heck of a lot there, Marie. What are your thoughts on all of that?
No, that's great. I was just going to add too that there are indications that, you know, that the Senate will not just roll over and lay down. And so you know, my hope is that they do. My hope is that we keep it a stable, you know, checks and balances equals a stable government. I just saw that in the chat. So um and I think that again, much of this, well, the education, much of that is at the, you know, the K-12 is at the local, you know, more at the state level and the local level. And that's the move that they're wanting to do anyhow, is to, you know, go back to more state power and less federal government. Um, we'll see. We'll see. And again, back to the whole idea, like you know, you just can't dismantle the Department of Education in one fell swoop. And things don't change that quickly. I mean, we know, you know, past history has shown us, and we know what has been said, but we still don't know for sure what is really going to happen. And there's indications, and you know, we will just kind of go from there. So, but I think, you know, I mean, I'm trying, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the notes and everything because we've kind of jumped around a little bit about that. Um, but we also want to underscore the importance of local government and being and paying attention to what's happening at home. So, paying attention to your local school boards and your local, well, just even your state government and that kind of thing, is really important to do, and write letters and um, those kinds of things. Again, Whitney really covered a lot there, so I'm not sure what else there is to
Well, I
really
think
talk about. But I'm also thinking that maybe, Carmen, are there questions in the Q&A that we could turn to a little bit right now?
Not currently.
Okay, it's
so.
just
I think we can go back to that idea, and I think we kind of settled on this, like that the dissolution of the Department of Education requires congressional action. And as we talked about congressional action, we're not sure what kind of Congress is going to show up, right?
Mhm.
Which is incredibly interesting. And we have not yet, unless it's happened in the last 3 hours, seen a nominee for the Department of Education, for Secretary of Education. And a couple of the names on the short list could provide some hints, right? Betsy DeVos, who was Secretary of Education under President Trump's first term, and kind of left by picking a fight and not supporting him at the end. Um, has said she would come back to dismantle the department. So if we see her name come forward, I think that that's really a clue as to how seriously this dismantle the department is being taken. Um, and Virginia Fox, who's chaired the House committee um, on education and the workforce for the past couple of sessions, is another name that I've seen out there. She definitely has a pattern of sort of having an agenda and sticking to it, and at all costs. And so she would be a different kind of leader. But like Marie said, I don't think that is something that could happen, but is not going to happen quickly. The things that, aside from the federal student loan issue, which I think is the potential sort of administrative logjam that could cause real problems for our students. I think that there are other issues that could come out of the DOE as it relates to that are more of an issue about our students' experiences when they get onto campus, right? So, if we're thinking about accreditation and the ways in which that allows for free speech or encourages studying of a variety of disciplines, or the way that that shifts, and the way we're seeing that shift from some state governments, um, we've got issues there that I think are kind of a big deal. And Marie, you and I talked about um, campus presidents and campus boards of trustees, and this is an issue at public flagships, which is where I'm finding in my practice a lot more students are interested. Between sort of, we've got at the trustee level, you've got politically appointed trustees in some states, and you've got elected trustees in others. And then at the campus presidency level, we've got presidents who are coming from within the academy, and who are academics and instructors and researchers at their core. And the other side of that coin is we've got the sort of businessmen political presidents. We had Ben Sasse in Florida, we had Mitch Daniels at Purdue. Um, and there are some other ones in there. And I think that 10 years ago, I would have told you that who the president was didn't impact my students' experience on campus. And I'm rethinking that.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, and I think, part of this, the crackdown on the campus protests and that kind of thing, and how, what is that going to look like as but of course the war is supposed to be over in a day, so once our new president takes office. So But who knows, like with the campus protests and that crackdown on that, I mean, that comes from the president's office. And so, depending on how he feels about that, he or she, I should say, that'll influence what is happening on campus. I think that, I know in my practice, I'm having to have conversations about going to a school in a certain state, depending on what the the laws are there, and are people feeling protected, or that kind of thing. And Carmen has come on, so we must have some questions.
Yes, there is one question in the chat, and it is kind of in line with what you're talking about. So, the day after an election, the day after the election, a mom emailed me with the threat of dismantling the DOE and pulling all funding from private colleges. Should my students only be considering private colleges? Have you seen anything? Or I've seen nothing to this effect. How about either of you?
Well, I think that there are certain states where, um, gosh, I kind of wish Robert Powers was on here, because he could probably talk about that really well, like the Title IX protections, and where do students feel safe if and follow the state legislator and what they're doing as far as, do they have protections? What does that look like, on each campus? And it's going to be different for every state. And I think that, for the most part, I think private colleges probably will be exempt because they're not getting any money from the state, that particular state. Um, but that's kind of a sad thing too, when we're only going to be considering private colleges, to do that. I don't know the answer, really, to that. I don't know, Whitney, if you have anything to add to that.
I think, you know, families have to decide what's important to them, right? And I think we've all had some students over the past 3 or 4 years who've walked into our office and said, I am only going to college in these states, or reproductive rights are really important to me, or I'm a member of the LGBTQ community and I need to make sure that I feel safe on campus, or whatever the politically oriented issue is, right? And we as counselors have adapted and supported those requirements. So it comes back to that family is, for some of my kids, the access to majors that might be considered DEI influenced majors is important. For some students, it's the access to DEI support services. And I don't think it's totally clear how far reaching all of this is, right? Does this mean that we're headed to a place where you cannot have a Black student union on your campus? Um, and so, will my student feel supported there? I think is a real question. And I think that's going to vary by student and by family. For some of my kids, they'll be like, this doesn't matter to me. I don't care about politics. I really I'm in it for the football games on Saturday. Um, and for other kids, it's totally integral. And for some kids, they're looking at like, let me see how quickly I can get out of the United States. And I know that Becky mentioned that. I know other counselors have mentioned like Wednesday morning, the emails were flying in on like, is it too late to apply to Canada? Um, and so I think these are great teaching opportunities for us with our young people about what does this mean?
Mhm.
How do you make these decisions? How do you choose a community that you want to be a part in? And sometimes that's about safety, and sometimes that's about comfort, and sometimes that's about fighting. And I can't tell any student what the right place for them is, but I can encourage them to think about this
Mhm.
as a piece of their college search.
Mhm. Mhm.
Marie, what about you?
Well, I agree with what you're saying. I think that, I mean, being in Portland, Oregon, um, it's kind of interesting to me, because my students typically, I mean, I work with students all over, but the ones that are in the Oregon area, um, they don't even know how liberal they've been raised. And so when you start talking to them about, conservative, liberal, this and that, they're just like, what? I'm not liberal. And I'm like, oh, honey, you don't even know how liberal you are, despite you growing up here. But I mean, then you start talking about reproductive health. You talk about, um, you know, being able to carry a gun on campus. You start saying all these things, and they're like, no, no, there's no way I would do that. So it's not, sometimes it's the words we use as we're talking to the students, and what, and how they have feelings about that. But kind of just to go back to, a lot of this, and I guess this is kind of our theme a little bit, is we still don't know. We still don't know. And some of these potential changes will take some time. And it's important to remember too that even though we've got the Republican Senate and the Republican House, they're working on their own reelections, right? And so they have to pay attention to their constituents. Now, will that, what are their constituents saying? And if they're not, they need to be more in line with their constituents than maybe what the president is, the direction he's going. So I hold out hope on that part. Um, and it's interesting because I was just talking to a friend the other night at our book club, and she actually had done some canvassing. And she talked to a number of people that are affiliated with the Democratic Party that said they were voting for Trump. And it was all the hyperbole about, the cost of eggs and that kind of thing. And, and at the end of the day, that's what a lot of people heard. We'll see what happens, when eggs still cost the same amount of money or not, we'll see. All of this remains to be seen. And I think that's probably one of the bigger takeaways. Um, that's where I am anyhow. Any more? Are there? It looks like there's some questions in the Q&A, but Carmen didn't come on, so I don't know. Oh, there she is.
Hi. So it is a follow-up from Rebecca. So I just spoke to one of my students in the UK, and he said on November 6th, international students in his school received an email from American universities saying something to the effect of still apply. I wonder if universities are worried.
Well, I just got an email from the UK study expert this morning, and one of the little headlines seemed to, like everybody's leaving and going to the UK to study kind of thing. And I don't think that's what they meant necessarily, but um, and at the same time, I read another article before the election that said that, there wasn't that big rush of students looking to go to the UK. I mean, Canada's probably a little has had more, but I don't think that, um, there's a whole lot of things that come with going to school in the UK, right? Completely different than the American system. And think I saw Ellen's name on there, and she could probably talk to that too. But it's a different kind of, it's not just like I'm going to get out of I mean, it feels to me like that would be a really rash judgment to say I want to get out of the country and I want to go study in another country, but and not really taking into consideration what you want to study, what kind of environment, all of that, all the things that we ask our students to think about as they're looking at colleges.
Well, and as Marcia mentioned in the chat too, I saw the same article about about the potential reduced visa limits, which Canada had announced a year ago, that they were going to be tighter starting with fall 2025. And so it's unclear how that's going to impact our students who might apply to Australia, to the UK, to Canada. But I think if we're going back to what we might see from the Trump administration, um, one of the levers that the president has to pull in January is executive actions. And one of Trump's first executive actions in his last term was the institution of the travel ban. And it took a couple of tries to hit something that was judicially permissible. Um, but could we see that come back? And while that doesn't impact our students going out as much as it impacts who comes to the United States, it impacts who shows up on our college campuses and what that looks like for kids. And I think that that is something that we could potentially see um, when all of this starts to move and move forward under the priorities of a new administration. Carmen?
So there's another question in the chat. Moving forward, are you considering changing the way you will have your students research schools going forward? And additionally, what advice are you giving to seniors as they finish their application or when they deposit?
That's a good question. As far as the seniors go, we're still waiting to hear back, where they've been accepted. So that conversation seems a bit premature maybe right now for me. But as I look at, as we look at schools and, talking with the juniors right now, trying to check their anxiety level or the parents' anxiety level. And, maybe that, and if they are really feeling that way, then let's consider some schools. I think at the end of the day, the way that I like to work is basically meet the student where they are and the family and that kind of thing. And there was a comment in the chat about, they come from all political spectrums, and that is very true. And so it's our job to meet them where they are and not probably force our opinion on them and as they're choosing where they tend to want to attend.
And I think I talk a lot with my students who don't apply early decision someplace about the gift of time of being able to go through their senior year and have another 6 months to make a decision about where they're going to go in the future. And I think that, again, in general, my belief is that government is a fairly slow moving machine. And encouraging students not to make rash reactions. If a student is upset or scared, do we want to consider applying to a few more places? Possibly. Let's talk about that. Let's consider doing that. But if they have until May 1st to make their decision at this point, I'm encouraging them to take that and see what types of things unfold. These are students who are just now developing their own agency as young adults to consider what's important to them. And so as a counselor, it's my space to be their backboard as they think about these issues and talk about these issues. And so yes, Magda, I'm more concerned about kids who I think might want a few more schools on their list because of concerns about their own safety or belonging. But otherwise, I'm saying, let's see what happens. Why don't you continue to think about these issues? Why don't you continue to play them out and see what happens? In the same way that I have not gone running to another country to try to get citizenship in the wake of the election either. I have to think about things. I have to figure out what issues are important to me and how I'm going to take steps forward to live within the government that was elected by the majority of Americans at this point. And that another link that's going to be in the show notes is to Heather Cox Richardson's interview with Jon Stewart last week, which was really terrific in looking at sort of the cyclical nature of government, of voting, of democracy, and the way that that's changed over time. And it's really a really fabulous conversation, no matter where you are in the political spectrum, to kind of try to empathize and see other points of view. So that's worth a listen. But really, I'm trying to encourage kids to, okay, let's expand our plans if you want to have more options, but let's not rush to judgment. Let's not rush to the world is burning down. If that's the way you feel, I'm going to acknowledge that. But the only way to do this is to go through it, not around it. We're not going to magically wake up 5 years from now if this isn't the administration that you support. So we gotta keep moving forward and fighting the good fight. for whatever it is you want, and whatever it is you believe in, because that's what democracy is rooted in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I think that was one of maybe our somewhat closing points was, NACAC has revised their advocacy page, and there's, writing to your legislators about your concerns, you know, telling stories in those letters, if you choose to write letters, is telling your own personal story. There's plenty of templates out there, but I think that the personal stories are what get the attention. And I think we need to just really do more of that and advocating. Obviously, Whitney and I are both we're walking the talk or whatever it is, and both in our states and at the national level. So yeah, it's sorry, I keep coming back to this whole idea of like we just don't know. So we have to stay grounded. We have to keep doing the things we do, the good work, fight the good fight, all of those things. And I see maybe we need to start a list of colleges that we can recommend on all of this. I don't I think what you're asking is about private universities that are marketing to alleviate fears for students. I think as college deadlines are coming and they're getting into reading system, I just don't know how many that would be on their radar. But to that point, maybe as you're talking to different college admissions reps, and yeah, they're just the low man on the totem pole, but sending that back up the chain with them, that some of the colleges could do a good job, maybe want to do, what are you doing to alleviate the fears of the students. So yeah.
I think, and if anyone's talked to me about government relations before, you know that I'm a firm believer in act locally. There's that old saying of all politics is local politics, and that gets back to some of the exit polling showing that everyone was voting based on the cost of eggs and their feeling about that. Okay, that's local. That's what's happening to me right now. And for some of us and for some of our students, what's happening to me right now is reproductive rights. You can start by reaching that right now is a state issue. You can start by reaching out to your legislators. In some states, it's more settled than others. Um, for some people, it's support for the LGBTQIA plus community. You can reach out to legislators and talk about what is happening. There's a bill in front of that the Ohio Senate passed about bathrooms yesterday, I think, and it's going to be signed by the governor, and that has real implications for our students. But follow your state legislators, follow the legislative bills and actions that are going on in your state. If you see something that impacts the work we're doing with students as they move on to college, reach out to the government relations committees from IECA, from NACAC, from your regional ACAC, because there are structures in place that are designed to help you amplify your voice when it's an issue that is really directly, closely aligned with the missions of those organizations. If it's not, you can also find tools on how to use your own voice to advocate for the issues that are important to you. And I'd encourage everyone to take that moment to do that. I served in local elective office for 6 years, and learned so much about my community and the role of government and governance and institutions. And there's just a lot there that is really worth um, digging into and fighting for. And hopefully, in the process of doing that fighting, we will become better at talking to one another rather than talking through one another.
Absolutely. So working our way through the problem, but not talking through people. So
So I'd encourage all of you out there listening, if you have things you want us to talk about, like let's pop it into the chat or the Q&A, because Um, this is about all of us, and we all do have different issues or fears or things that um, are going on.
Doesn't look
So
there's
everyone's ready for their Friday afternoon to start.
great.
But I know, Maria, I probably speak for you as well. Happy to engage and talk about some of what's going on at any point. Um, so this is important to you. It's something that I spend way too much time thinking about.
Mhm.
Oh, wait, Ellen's going to jump in.
Yes, so Ellen said, okay, I'll bite. My fear is a student loan overhaul that will continue the systematic racism in our country by keeping low socioeconomic students and families from getting the funding to go to school without being gouged.
That's a
Ellen, I
real fear.
totally agree. I think that that's a real fear. I think too that what we're likely to see from the Trump administration is a loosening of the guardrails that President Biden put on for-profit education, and those loans and changes to the whole purpose of accreditation is in part to determine who can access federal money. You have to be an accredited institution to gain access to federal funds. So I think that there's a lot there, and the complexity of being educated about this system is it's complex. And if you are a student who has not grown up in the higher education atmosphere, the barriers are high.
Hmm.
So, one of NACAC's talking points for the past couple of years in advocacy has been on increasing Pell Grant for those students, and that I'm sure that that will continue to be a NACAC advocacy point, um, although that's just my speculation. At the same time, if I'm looking at what's coming out of the Government Efficiency Commission, I'm fearful that those monies are going to be cut because that falls into potentially that discretionary spending bucket.
Well, the Pell Grant won't be eliminated. We know that because that's a piece of legislation. It's more the student loan programs and that, but that will, and that, I'm not saying that that will impact a good number of schools. I know I was talking to, she works in admissions at the local community college here, and just with the FAFSA debacle this last year, students aren't enrolling in community college. We aren't not a state that has free community college, but that definitely is an impact if the kids can't get the money they need to go to college. So, and we know also that when students don't enroll, they don't come back either, or very few do. So, I think that, these are definitely big concerns. And again, this is, writing to your legislators, and thank you, for the issues that are really important to you. And Carmen, you must have one.
Yes, there's another one in the chat. Is there a fear with this change that our students shouldn't go into the education field to be teachers because they may no longer be needed?
Well, that's a depressing thought.
Woo! Um, I don't think we're to the point of eliminating schools. That's not like to me, that's taking things 10 steps down the road. Um, but I have heard that public student loan forgiveness could be on the table. I think that, we've been having a lot of questions. I think we have to separate out the value of higher education conversations from the value of K-12 conversations, because I think that they are different. I value education at all levels, but I know that that's not the way the large portion of Americans are feeling right now. Um, but should we pay teachers more? That's often state and local legislation. Um, and some of that could be impacted by what I perceive to be a less labor union friendly environment in the next administration. So I would hope I get excited when I have students who want to be teachers. There aren't enough of them. Um, and then occasionally I have a parent whose child wants to be a teacher, and the parent sits in a meeting with me and says, "No, you should be a computer science major instead." And I want to cry. Um, but yeah, I don't think that we're to the point of not needing teachers. I think we have many bigger societal questions to answer about the role of teachers and about what we ask teachers to do. And frankly, the role of schools in our communities. But we're going way down the K-12 rabbit hole right there.
Mhm.
There's another question here asking about the ability to reduce the Pell Grant and talk of the work study being drastically reduced. Work study definitely falls into the discretionary funding stuff bucket and could be reduced. And also, my understanding is that can be so what's happening right now in a closely divided Congress is that we've got the filibuster, which requires 60 votes in the Senate to move legislation forward. The filibuster does not apply to appropriations bills. And so things that have a cost can be added or taken away through appropriations, which removes the filibuster. So I think that I can't imagine that that would be popular, but I can see how it happens.
Maybe one more
Marie, you want to take you
Yeah,
want to
so
take this one?
Sure.
a few more. So legislation and academic gag orders. How threatened is college curriculum? Will this be determined by state?
I think it's too soon to tell. I think that you know, and again, this is going to fall red states, blue states, that kind of thing, and what historically, I don't think state governments pay a whole lot of attention to higher ed and all the things that go on. They're really more focused on K through 12 in my experience in Oregon, anyhow. But this is another one of these things we just really don't know. And I would imagine that again, that's going to be a state issue. So the state government, the governor, what are the priorities in the individual states towards higher ed and what things get removed or added?
Well, but I think that there is real movement to consider right here in what's happening. So there are a couple of things. We're going back to the idea of, is the College Board of Trustees, so this would be at public universities, are those political appointees or are they elected? And what's happening there? Because when they are political appointees, there is a different level of accountability than if they are elected by the citizens of the state. And I think that that matters in the decisions that are made. I also think that university risk tolerance has been tested a lot in the last 2 years between the SCOTUS decision and the on campus protests, and now issues related to the election and DEI. Um, the threat of a lawsuit, the threat of action by the OCR, um, that alone is enough to change behaviors and for some schools. Some schools are out there saying, we're going to do things our way, and if you want to fight us, fight us. And some schools are like, yeah, we can't afford that. And so, like, whether it's in the court of public opinion or in terms of the actual dollars that it's going to cost, we're going to see both of those things come true. And we're seeing that in the statement of neutrality from like on many colleges and universities are starting to say, we're not going to make statements about political things. Um, and I think that there's a lot you can say that's good and bad about that nonpartisanship. I think there's value there. And there was a New York Times article about that the other day. I'll pop that in the chat for everybody. Um, but I think that that's one example of the way we're seeing this sort of trickle down to, how much do universities want to get involved?
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for that. I think we could have this conversation for probably another hour. Um, but I'm sure everyone's excited to start their Friday. So thank you, Marie and Whitney, for joining us today in this conversation. And everyone, please have a good Friday. Take care of yourself. Practice some self-care. This weekend in light of the election. And I hope to see you next time with Cindy. And thank you for coming to Cindy's Friday Forum. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good week.